It's Just Business with Steve Thomas and your host, Chris Larry.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of It's Just Business on the Hogstide Network, the show where we look at the dollars and cents of the sports media business industrial complex, intergalactic federation. How you doing today, Steve?
Intergalactic Federation. That's interesting. Yeah, doing all right. We are recording this on Saturday morning, so we're in the midst of our annual draft slog, which is simultaneously a lot of fun, yet very, very old, I'd say, by the time we get through it all. Because I always end up watching all 7 rounds of this thing to make sure that nothing goes on I need to write about. And by the time Saturday afternoon rolls around, I'm sick and tired of television. But this is our life in with our fake job. How are you doing?
I'm not doing too bad. Yeah, I was saying, Steve, a little bit before we hit record. I love draft. I love the draft when the draft wasn't cool. So I'll be one of those hipsters on that front. But it's gotten so showbiz. But the ratings, apparently, at least for day one, were up. You know, I thought Kansas City did a pretty good job of sort of highlighting itself, which means more and more markets and cities will want in on that game. So they have kind of created a moving circus even in the last just couple years.
See, I've watched the draft from the early days too. Which goes back a long way, obviously. And, when you're an introvert, you have nothing to do but, be in your room. And so, the draft used to be all day Saturday, then all day Sunday. So I used to just sit there on the weekends and watch these things all weekend. So it hasn't, in some ways it's come a long way. In some ways it hasn't, because I think the presentation now is way more glitz and glamoury and less substantive, I'd say, than it was before. I didn't even know there was an ABC broadcast of the draft this year. Apparently there was an ABC broadcast.
I think that got instituted once they did the Thursday round 1 prime time.
I didn't even realize that. And so what somebody told me was, based on what somebody described it to me, it seemed like that was more showbiz, less hardcore football, which isn't surprising on ABC.
Yeah. I mean, it's a showbiz product.
Yeah. I told Chris before, I mean, I've don't like ESPN, so I always watch the NFL Network in the hopes that is going to be a bit more substantive. For the most part, it is, but I don't know, man. If I was a draft pick, I probably would not want to come to the green room at the draft site. I really wouldn't, because you never know what's going to happen. Like every year, there's a Will Levis who sits there and gets embarrassed on national television. I mean, his parents look horrified, who are sitting with him. I assume it was his parents. So I think I would probably just want to be home.
I don't know, because I guess there's 3 categories of choice, right? There's, be at the event, be fully cameraed up in your home, which I could also have all kinds of negatives for why I wouldn't want that. Yes. I'd rather be in their space than have them be in my space to a degree, especially if and when things go south. And then there's have nothing to do, which if you go about midway down round 2 into round 3, and that's the case for most of the players that are going to get drafted, they're not involved at all. So I don't know if I'd want them in my home. But did you see what whoever was putting this together from an image standpoint with Will Levis did great damage comms, because all they did was put hot babes on the couch with him. For like, once he went past like 12 or 15, they were just like, they could be sisters. I quite frankly, maybe this shows my age, I think one was his mom. So it was just like, get all the beautiful women that are near here, and he was like rolling 2 or 3 deep on the couch the rest of the night.
Just comforting him with femininity, I guess.
Yeah, so it was pretty that was actually one of my favorite things to watch as the Will Levis drop began.
I did notice that, but there's a 4th category. It's the other category of that are the folks that clearly go to Airbnbs.
Yes,
some of those people are not at home.
Or rent a house
or something. That's probably You're right. I would not want an ESPN camera crew in my house. And some of these guys probably, their homes are probably less than something you'd want to advertise on TV because some of them are from, poor economic circumstances. So yeah, but it's my guess is that the agents are probably renting Airbnbs somewhere in the city where they are. That's probably what I would do. But my point is, I would not want to be in the middle of the hoopla. That's what I'm saying.
Yeah. And although I would scare, you'd still have Uncle Fester there at your Airbnb party. You don't necessarily want wandering on cam.
Well, yeah, that's true. There's going to be that one guy
Yeah.
who's missing a tooth, and yeah.
Yeah. So, all right. So, we'll stay in the National Football League and talk about some players who at one time were excited about the draft, but are now sidelined for 6 months to a year, depending on the various cases, which we don't really have all the details on, which we'll talk about. But we're only about, at this point, by the time you're listening to this, probably a week, 10 days out from the suspension of a handful of players for gambling violations, let's call them, because that's the most sort of generic we can be with the details we have. Steve?
Yeah. So if you want to read about this, CNBC has the story, among others. NFL suspends 5 players for violating gambling policies by Natasha Pignon from April 21st, which again is a week ago or 8 days ago for us. 4 Detroit Lions, 1 Washington player, Shaka Toney, for those of you who follow the Hogsty. So Detroit went ahead and released the 2 players who were suspended indefinitely, and then Shaka Toney was also suspended indefinitely. So that's worse than it sounds. And then 2 players had lesser suspensions, which we'll get to. But so the suspended indefinitely thing means this is kind of like the maximum first offense punishment that the league can give. And what it means is they're suspended indefinitely, but a year from now they can apply for reinstatement. And so unless they really screw something up, they will probably be reinstated. But this tells me that of these 5, those 3 were doing something worse. I don't think the NFL would suspend indefinitely for like a poker game in the locker room. That's gambling. So my guess is that those players were like probably betting on football. Now the Lions, or the NFL rather, says in here that no games were compromised as a result of the gambling, meaning that these players probably did not bet on their own team. And by the way, so the 3 were, if you're interested, C.J. Moore and Quintez Cephas of the Lions, and then Shaka Toney, like I said. So it sounds like those 3 were probably betting on football, just probably not their own teams. And the other 2 were Stanley Berryhill and Jameson Williams. They were suspended from playing the first 6 regular season games. So obviously they didn't get a full year indefinite suspension, so they were doing something less. Now it's a bit ironic, right? And this is what I wanted to really bring up in this. We're cracking down on the players, yet the NFL is simultaneously jumping in the sack with every major gambling institution they can find. DraftKings, they put teams in Vegas. They are all about fantasy football, which is just another kind of form of gambling for a lot of people. So is the NFL being a bit sanctimonious about something when they're doing it themselves?
Longtime Hogstide listeners, and it would, nice to meet you. We'll notice slight times where Steve and I trade hats. This is actually kind of an interesting version of one of those times, because I actually find, is the sanctimonious hypocrisy, a giant wattage bulb that radiates through this whole story? Of course. But I actually think it's more fake. I think it's a little bit of a paper tiger. And to me, the dog won't hunt on this angle of it, because of a few things. One, the players actually benefit from that revenue. So anybody who's actually thinking smartly about this, it's not players versus owners, because all, the players are rooting for all that revenue too, right? That benefits all. The players get what, 49% of revenue or whatever the last
Something like
whatever
that, yeah.
the percentages. So it's not like that DraftKings revenue, at all is somehow like the, only the owners. It's not the luxury box of like, owner ticket sharings or anything like that. So that's point one. Point two is, if you're working the craps table as a croupier in Vegas, guess what? You're heavily monitored and regulated about where and how and when you can gamble as well, because you're part of the industry that is benefiting from that ecosystem. So, and the NFL came down heavy on that wide receiver, Calvin Ridley, is now a Jacksonville Jaguar. They came down and he spent a year sidelined for probably what turned out to be like an $1,000 bet. And we're not even sure if maybe they did say it was on an NFL game. Who knows?
I think it was.
So to me, you have to be pretty dumb. And we only have one player that's even in the upper echelon of the conversation of NFL players, and mostly just because of his injury and draft status. There's really been no on-field NFL production
How
as
about
of
C.J.
yet.
Moore?
No, Williams, the Detroit receiver.
Jameson Williams. Yeah.
Yeah. That's what I'm saying. The notoriety comes from his narrative from moving from college to the professional than it does about anything he's done on the field. So these are all low-hanging fruit players. So that, to me, so yes, I've gone a long way to say the hypocrisy is obvious, but to me, you should know the rules of the game, and it's not like they're not benefiting.
Yeah, well, you have to be a special kind of idiot to want to put at risk your at a minimum $800,000 a year job to place a couple bets here and there on some sporting events. That really takes a genius. Why on earth would you want to do that to make a little bit of extra money when you've got one of the best jobs in America? It's a 9-month-a-year job. I mean, you work hard during the 9 months and all that, but you have 3 months off, and you're in the upper 1% of income in the country, and you're going to risk all of that to gamble. That just, I'll never ever understand that. But yeah, I actually kind of agree with you. And by me calling him sanctimonious wasn't implying that the players weren't benefiting, because you're right. If the league media advertising income goes up, that makes the salary cap go up, which makes the players ultimately benefit. So I 100% agree with you, there. But I find it a bit hypocritical, as you said. I think you called it a giant ball of hypocritical sanctimony or something, which is
a high wattage bulb.
high wattage bulb of hypocritical sanctimony. It's like Donald Trump's nickname for Ron DeSantis. Ron DeSanctimonious. The world's worst nickname. Yeah. Anyway, so I don't understand what these players are thinking. When they're doing this. Let's see. There was one other thing I wanted to mention in here. By the way, the teams basically didn't say much of anything. They got a comment. The Lions said they became aware of the NFL's investigation a month ago. We were disappointed by the decision making demonstrated by Stanley and Jameson, and we will work with both players to ensure they understand the severity of these violations and have clarity on the league rules going forward. Those are the two guys that the Lions didn't cut. And then for Washington's part, they just said, we have cooperated fully with the NFL's investigation since receiving notice and support the league's findings and actions, at the end. And by the way, from a Washington standpoint, just think about the investigations that have gone on in this team.
Right.
I mean, they had the DEA in the building a year ago, remember? I mean,
yeah.
And Congress, and now they've got gambling. This is not exactly a model franchise, kiddos, if anybody thought it was.
Yeah, no one wants this much. No entity, whether they're doing good or ill or the murky gray area, wants this much attention.
No, I know. It's just like what's one more investigation? What the hell? Yet please support us,
oh, go ahead.
No, this is coming on the heels of them settling. Did we mention this last time? That I think we did. That the team also simultaneously settled the lawsuit
the
brought
old
by
deposits.
the deposits lawsuit brought by the Washington D.C. District Attorney. So that was another investigation going on. Now we have gambling. the DEA investigation with the trainer, the whole stuff with the ownership, it's just a never-ending train wreck. At this point, it's almost, like the looky-loos on the freeway when you see the accident, like what other disaster can happen. But in terms of this, I think we probably asked this decades ago when Pete Rose got suspended, but is this something that the NFL really ought to care about? Granted, don't bet on your own team, but is it really that big of a crisis if a player from the Lions bets on like the Steelers and the Jaguars or something? Does it really matter that much?
I think probably the answer is yes, but I think the problem here, and this is where I would put a good amount of blame on the NFL, is they obviously, and we rushed into this so fast. It was like a light. We've talked about it before. It was like a light switch. It was like lights off, lights on. So without much considering any of the downstream, kind of third order implications that are the ones that bite you anyway. And this to me is an example of that. They have obviously not defined and or communicated clearly what the policies are for the players. And so if the expectation is that the players uphold their bargain to earn this revenue as a collective, a collectively bargained agreement, et cetera, and they don't know what the rules of the game are, then that ultimately becomes a problem with the NFL. And these last 2 years from Ridley and through these suspensions should really tell the NFL that they have not done that clearly. They might claim that the rules are there on black and white, but they're not communicating them. So where can you gamble? Can you gamble on the premises? How does your geolocation go into that? Can you bet on college football? Can you bet on no professional sports? Can you bet on games that aren't on your team? Can you bet on games that are in your division? So obviously these things are not clear at all. And if they want this to work, which is what you and I have said many times, if they want this revenue stream, then they have to be hyper vigilant on all fronts.
Yes. However, maybe the devil's advocate position to that is there's 1,500 players and another maybe 300 something practice squad players, and of those, over the last year they've had 6 problems.
Right, that's true.
And so that's, what is that, 0.05%? Less than that, 0.04% or something. So 0.5%. So they haven't had a ton of problems. And this also, let's admit that a lot of players are pretty dumb. Okay, they have a talent. They've focused on athletics all their life. A lot of them aren't that bright, and so I think you're going to have a handful of bad apples no matter what. I don't know Shaka Tony from Adam other than talking about him on the Hogsty, here and there. Maybe the guy just did something stupid. Maybe he doesn't care. Maybe he's a rebel. But your larger point holds, which is, I liked your description of light on, light off, because that kind of is what happened with gambling. If you go back 10 years ago, we don't even want to have a team even in the state of Nevada at all because of the even perceived implications that the NFL would be involved in gambling, which would call the credibility of the league in question, which brings the shield at risk, which risks money. And all of that just went boom, gone. As soon as that Supreme Court opinion about, gambling a couple years ago came out, then it's just gone. And so, yeah, maybe they do need to do a better job of clearly defining the rules. Because again, I would ask the same, come back to it. What's the harm in what if they bet on a baseball game? Okay, don't gamble on premise. It's a business. That ought to be clear. But is it really so bad? If somebody bets on some professional sports, and is it really the NFL's problem if somebody wants to waste all their money on gambling? I mean, they make a personal choice. Some people are going to invest it in, tax-free muni bonds, and other people are going to go blow it in Vegas, and that's just life. So I don't know if it's a huge problem. Maybe betting on the NFL when you're an employee of the NFL, yes. But it's weird for me to say this because I'm usually Mr. Hoity-toity when it comes to rules and stuff. But and I guess it needs to be said, we don't really know what the rules are. What can they do?
Well, and that therein lies the main issue too. They're good, And I totally agree. This is a low percentage. Also, there's nothing that even remotely whiffs the top 3/4 of relevant players in the NFL.
No, these guys are all
Right.
Yeah.
So it's not many, and it's real bottom feeders in terms of the talent pecking order of the NFL. And so we're not talking about it that big a problem. So if I'm the NFL and I'm being smart and I'm being forward looking, I'm saying this is the canary in the coal mine that tells me I need to tighten up and communicate my rules.
Yes. I'm trying to real quick on the fly because we didn't think about this beforehand. Okay, so CBS News. I just Googled what are the NFL's gambling rules, and the very first thing that came up with was a quote from CBS News. So, to the extent they're reliable, NFL players and personnel are not allowed to engage in gambling in NFL facilities, disclose any non-public NFL information, enter a sports book during the NFL season, or maintain any social, business, or personal relationships with sports gamblers. So if you go on those, if that is the rule, yeah, okay. Um, so you can't play poker in the locker room, anything like that. You couldn't take injury reports that aren't public and go out and use them. Now enter a sports book during the NFL season.
That gets murky because how
That
many of these
yes,
places have sports books? Do you think you're playing roulette?
that's exactly right. That's exactly what I was going to say. And then add to that, you don't need to enter into a sports book to do online gambling. You know, is there a could you claim entering is virtually entering?
Well, that's definitely what the NFL claims when they say you can't. So if you let's say you're a player and you put a bet on the NHL from your bet you're outside your locker room sitting in the training facility. Um, you have to understand that the app by law has to know exactly where you are. This is geolocation is essential to legal gambling because
It's not legal in every
legal in
state.
Utah is not in Virginia, and so or whatever, and some places this isn't legal yet. So the app has to know if you can legally purchase the bet from your exact location. So then the NFL, they'll know from a digital triangulation perspective where that bet was placed, and if you and DraftKings will hand that over to them in 2 seconds because it's in everyone's best interest. So
I bet you it's even a contractual thing in the
yeah,
advertising
totally.
contracts.
Totally. So there you go. So there's a very clear way that they can police that, and that's probably the stadium facilities, the training facilities. There's probably a variety of definitions of what that is.
Well, yeah, NFL facilities would
Yeah, fraud.
encapsulate all of that.
Yeah.
And by the way, I mean, just Google how to use a VPN, and for God's sakes, if you're going to choose to do this, but that's neither here nor there. Okay, so that's the rule, and so you have to think that the three guys who got the indefinite suspensions,
Those had to be NFL bets.
they had to be in NFL bets, and I would guess the other two, you got suspended for 6 games,
Betting on the NBA from the locker room.
or you played poker one night, after
Yeah, I
practice or
guess.
something.
Yeah.
Yeah, something fairly minor. So we'll see. And does the NFL do anything new or different about this? I don't think so. Should they? Probably. Should they clarify? Yes. Maybe they do. And again, and people don't listen. That's entirely possible. Maybe they give an annual briefing, every year in training camp. I mean, I'm just speculating, but um, the stupid decisions of 6, or yeah, I guess 6 are not necessarily cause for panic just yet. So we'll see if they get more.
No, it's probably it probably as effective as the gambling webinar in mid-August to have some low-level players have their heads chopped off.
Yeah, or yeah, or the threatening financial education for rookies that nobody listens to.
Right.
It falls because look, again, there's the NFL like life. There's all kinds of people. Some people just aren't going to listen, and they're not going to get it. And karma always catches up with those types.
Yeah, so we'll know no one's paying attention to the rising sea levels in the NFL office if a big star falls this way. That'll be that's the thing to look for if they start to stem the tide and clean up their business, or they just let the party boat roll.
Yeah, and the last thing I'll say, oh, I just turned it off. So this rule does allow for some gambling because if you parse it from a legal perspective, not allowed to engage in gambling in NFL facilities. So I can gamble as long as it's not on NFL property. I can't disclose public NFL information, non-public NFL information. Okay,
You can
can't
bet on the NBA on an app from the comfort of your own home.
right. I can't go into a sports book during the NFL season, but I can not in the NFL. In the off season, I can. And I can't maintain social, business, or personal relationships with sports gamblers. So I can't get involved with, you know, Guido, the sports guy. That's
Yeah.
probably too ethnic, isn't it? With the mobster who runs the casino. I can't have a relationship with that. So it does leave room for operating there, and so if you violate those, they're not that restrictive. So if you violate those rules, I think it's kind of on you.
Yeah, they're clearly allowing players to gamble on all kinds of fronts. And I'll predict that the I didn't know there was a sports book in this casino is the new. I didn't know there was creatine in my protein shake.
What? Kind of, yeah. Oh, and by the way, the CBS News article where I got this, I just because we hadn't read this before the article, before the story. The very next paragraph, which just clicked off. Okay, I just hit the wrong button. But the very next sentence in the story said NFL players are allowed to gamble in their off time. Oh, here it is. It says, but they can place non-sports wagers at legally operated casinos and horse or dog tracks in their personal time, including during the season.
So their ability to gamble is still pretty widespread, in my opinion.
Yeah, yeah. All right.
All right. So next up, we'll stay in the NFL and we'll stay with it. Maybe we'll move to the metaphor of gambling, and that is what Lamar Jackson participated in for the last almost 18 months. Might even be on the conservative side in terms of estimating how long this drama has gone on. But his finally under contract. Everyone seems happy from an NFL standpoint. As an NFL fan standpoint, I'm happy. I love Lamar Jackson. I love Lamar Jackson in Baltimore. It's good for the league. It makes the most sense. It's an interesting offense. So I think kind of all's well that ends well. Everyone seems happy. But hats off to Lamar. He certainly got a pretty darn good contract for being your sole representative. But we are at the end, and it is time to debrief.
Yeah. And we're not going to go down the football side of it because that's not really the sports law and business and media. That's our topic. And first of all, if my Ravens fan friend is listening, I find it hilarious. He's a diehard Ravens fan and absolutely hates Lamar Jackson. I keep telling him, just be a Washington fan and watch yourself go through 30 quarterbacks, and see how you like it. But so the reason why I thought this was a sports business show topic is that what Lamar got was 5 years, 260 million, 185 million guaranteed. Base salary in 2023 of 32 million. So that is decidedly not a Deshaun Watson contract. That is what is, I think, the sports business topic. Recall that Mr. Pervert got 100% guaranteed. Okay, he got $230 million contract. I think it's 231. I think 100% guaranteed. That is what Lamar sought originally. That is not what he got. What he got instead was about a little under 70% guarantee, which is in line with the amount of guarantees for some of the big name quarterbacks. And you got to throw Kirk Cousins out too, because that was kind of a one-off contract. So 70%, the top in number is the largest in history, other than Patrick Mahomes. He got 350 million. But 70% is more along the lines of what the NFL is willing to pay. That is the story. What was clear and obvious was, well, partly that Lamar Jackson needed an agent, and so part of this dragging on is that. But the other part of it is the NFL successfully dodged having to pay him 100% guarantee.
Yeah, I'd say this. Congratulations, Lamar Jackson. You got a fantastic contract, top of the food chain. You should be happy. It makes sense. We can, and of course you weren't going to get the Deshaun Watson contract. That is such an anomaly. And it is so clear that we have, I'll call it implicit collusion going on here, which I don't even necessarily disagree with. But you had the Deshaun Watson contract is such an anomaly in a kind of neutral sense and an abomination in a kind of opinion sense that that was not going to create the standard. And I think what happened here is that agent Lamar Jackson finally understood how the world worked and then was able to hammer out a very good contract for the modern NFL with a Deshaun Watson just, not a part of that, because it clearly is not the trend. And we're seeing, whether it's Kyler Murray, whether it's Russell Wilson, whether it's Lamar Jackson now setting that kind of new bar in the fact and reality based world. I think that's what we're dealing with.
Yeah. We all kind of laughed at Lamar for being self-rep, but hey, listen, it worked out for him.
He's himself. Not hurt.
No, he saved himself about $15 million. He got the contract a fair contract that he deserved. You could argue about, Lamar Jackson's accuracy or whatever, but at the end of the day, he wins. He was a league MVP. He's been to multiple Pro Bowls. This is a contract that he deserves.
He's young.
He's young, yeah, with 26 years old, and he got it done. So, more power to him. And the truth is, if you I have looked at NFL contracts, the contract itself is a form that is approved by the Players Association. And so there's nothing to negotiate in terms of the basic terms of the language of the contract itself, like from a legal perspective, that you can throw an addendum on and add some more stuff on it. But it's not like he's having to go down and negotiate what I do for a living, which is argue about language and provisions and paragraphs and stuff. That's not what it is. So it's really with what he had to do was get the financial deal right, and he did that. So congratulations to him. But I just wanted to highlight this. I don't know if we necessarily need to spend 20 minutes, on this topic necessarily, but I wanted to highlight the fact that Lamar Jackson did not get 100% guarantee, and so mission accomplished from the ownership perspective. And would you use the term open collusion? I think you said
implicit collusion.
Implicit collusion, which. It's not real collusion, probably. I don't think the owners got on a Zoom conference call and said, we will not pay any quarterback 100% guarantee from now on. But I don't think it really had to be said. They weren't going to
even need a wink.
Yeah, exactly. It's like we all know. It's like if you've been married a long, long time, you kind of know what your spouse is thinking. Without having to say it. That's what happened here. It's like the owners know, we ain't doing this. And they don't even need to say it.
Let's say Deshaun Watson was, not, the hand job king. It was still a stupid, they would still be, the other owners would
still a dumb contract.
Still be in this mindset. You add that whole mishegoss, and to me, it is one of the most from the dark side stories you can think of. And we all like to think, oh, we're Washington football fans or Washington football associated. So Dan Snyder's the most hated owner in the NFL circle. Probably not. Haslam might be, because this was such an affront to everything that the NFL was trying to do on all fronts that he's probably the most vilified.
Maybe, yeah, he's certainly one of them, and the Browns have always kind of been the drunk uncle, anyway. The NFL, yeah, like we were talking about the uncle you don't want to see stumbling.
Yeah, you don't want the Cleveland Browns wandering on camera.
That's kind of the Cleveland Browns, and so the fact that Cleveland did this is not indicative of the motivations of the rest of the NFL. And don't forget, Jimmy Haslam's a guy who came within a gnat here of getting federal indictments himself personally over the business dealings of the Flying J truck stop, I think it is. So Jimmy Haslam is not a saint. He's certainly down there in the bottom 5 in terms of the owners, and probably one of the most disliked. You could throw little Danny in there, throw him in there. There's, I don't know, a handful of the guy up in Cincinnati's a butthead. I don't think he's well liked either. and so those guys. So again, it didn't need to be said. Um, I think it was fair. Lamar got what he deserved. The NFL preserved the status quo. All is well, and we can move on to the next one.
Yes, and the next one stays in, or at least partially in Baltimore. As we look at, we've had, well, Steve, you'll tell us if how much conclusion that we've kind of come to here. But we at least have had a judgment in the, I don't know, it feels like decades old battle between the Orioles and the Washington Nationals and the control and profits and blah, blah, blah from the MASN TV deal. This all goes back originally to the Montreal Expos moving to Washington. So what did this ruling do?
Okay, so we didn't have a judgment. What happened here this week, and you, if you want to read about this, this is. Oh, this is the Athletic, and I just clicked out. Okay, it's been other places, but this is the Athletic has a story, and it's called "Latest MASN TV Rights Court Ruling: What Does It Mean for the Orioles Nationals" by Dan Conley, dated April 25th. Actually, what just happened was this has been in arbitration. Okay, what happened this week was that the Orioles appealed the arbitrator's decision all the way to the highest court in the state of New York, which ironically, the New York Supreme Court is not the highest court in the state. It's the New York State Court of Appeals. And so what happened here is the Nationals and the Orioles have been arbitrating this MASN dispute in front of a subcommittee of the Major League Baseball, which is called the Revenue Sharing Definitions Committee. Now, that committee came down hard on the Orioles and very pro Nationals and said, the Nationals got screwed out of TV revenue. So the Orioles then claimed that subcommittee was biased and not impartial because of the people on the committee. And so in response to that, Rob Manfred, who's the commissioner of the Major League Baseball, put all new people on the arbitration panel, which is the committee, and then the new panel ruled the same as did the old one in favor of the Nationals. And at that point, then the Orioles appealed the judgment to the New York State Court of Appeals. What came out this week was the New York State Court of Appeals ruling in favor of Major League Baseball and the Nationals and against the Orioles. So the Orioles have lost every front, and basically the gist of it is, as we said in an earlier story, that the MASN TV deal came about when the Nationals moved into the area from Montreal. And because DC was within the territory of the Orioles got a sweetheart TV rights deal, which is the MASN deal. And so the dispute is that the Nationals have been making, not a lot of money all these years because of it. So that's that. So the interesting part of this, well, first of all, the only other appeal left would be to the Supreme Court, the United States Supreme Court. I don't know if there's a real constitutional issue here that the Supreme Court would be interested in taking. My sense is not. They take very few cases a year. This article says it's 2%. That sounds about right to me. So they could appeal to the Supreme Court. I don't think necessarily it's going to matter. So that part is over. But the interesting part of this is that this isn't even every dispute. This is just the revenue for 2012 to 2016. There are two more disputes ongoing about this for the revenue from 2017 to 2021, and then future revenue, which is 2022 2026. So there's two whole separate disputes that remain to be decided here. And so the effect of the impact, rather, of this decision is that all of this stuff's going to stay before the same panel, which probably means, I would assume, that the Orioles are going to get slaughtered 2 other times. That's, in a nutshell, your thoughts.
Yeah, I always, we followed this long ordeal here. You sort of always figured it was going to eventually break in the Nationals' favor. It's just that how long this has taken and sort of how multifaceted it is, right? So it's almost like one of those things where, the Nationals have the patience to collect on all these? And probably the answer is yes. And there's a couple of bigger contexts I think this story takes place in that we talked about before, or we've connected, or we've talked about these stories before. But connecting the dots, one is the sale of the Nationals itself and getting some of this stuff squared away, so you can actually get a real valuation, and it's interesting enough for enough people to make that worthwhile for the Lerners to sell. And Lerner Senior just passed away like last month, 6 weeks. So there's obviously a lot that goes on there, but it also is interesting from the regional sports network perspective, which we've talked about, and which really seems to be coming to a head, and what these leagues do to take over that space for themselves, so on and so forth. So, this sort of, you could see a world where if Major League Baseball came out with basically its own centralized option, which we've talked about looks like the trend, it almost wipes away this debate to some degree, the relevant, and has a whole new solution to solving this problem that wasn't even visible 2, 3, 5 years ago. So it actually, I would say, behooves, and then I'm forgetting the Orioles have a sale probable, coming up from the Angelos family. So this really is kind of the confluence of a bunch of different interesting sports business stories.
Yeah, I don't disagree with all that, and I think what Chris is saying with the centralized is, if Major League and the media rights deal is coming up, I think in a few years, because they signed a new one, but I don't think it was like a big 10-year. I might be wrong about that. But point is, what Chris is saying is that if all these games are going to be broadcast by MLB TV, it kind of limits the impact of the local broadcast anyway. And so in that regard, it's kind of a slightly different revenue model, I think going forward. I think that's what you're saying, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
totally. So if they're all just right, if they're signing giant TV deals and having, all run things, season pass or single game pass options, and, subscriptions all run through some kind of league shared media deal, then how Washington and Baltimore divvy up regional contracts is irrelevant.
Yeah.
Or mostly irrelevant.
Right. So this is not over here. Okay. So yeah, here. So the MLB ESPN contract runs through 2028. So it's longer than I thought. I thought it was in just a couple years. So that's just for 25 weeks of Sunday Night Baseball and a couple of associated things. So that's okay. And then Forbes has something where, okay, that was 4 billion. Yeah. So it runs through 2028. Okay. Anyway, so that's that. The reason why it's important to the sale is that when you sell major assets like that, people don't like to have hanging liabilities and uncertainty over it. And so from the Orioles perspective, if the Angelos family sells, and by the way, there's another disastrous ownership situation. The Angelos have done absolutely nothing to help the performance of the team on the field at all over
He was
decades.
Dan Snyder before Dan Snyder in general,
Yes.
and in the region.
Yes, exactly right. He was. But it really, having an open contingent liability like this really depresses market value, and so it behooves the Orioles to get this done. Now, just because there's a judgment that has now been held up by the highest court in New York does not mean you can't go mediate the judgment. I've done this. When you get a judgment by a court or an arbitration panel in this case, you could still go back and mediate the judgment and say, look, we'll stop fighting if you accept less. We'll stop appealing this and pay you now if you take 75%. I mean, they could do this, but point is, I think it behooves, especially in particular the Orioles, to get all this done. And so a future owner does not have an open question of how many hundreds of millions of dollars would I potentially owe the Nationals. And from the Nationals perspective, it's the same thing, but just kind of from a good side. It's, the claims are resolved, how much money is going to come in. If it's an unknown, that depresses the market value. So it's to behooves both of these teams. I think now that it's pretty clear the Orioles are going to have lost arguing about the nature of the arbitration panel, it would behoove them really to stop fighting and just cut a deal. Whether
Yeah,
the
yeah.
Angelos are smart enough to do that is another question.
And you've got I think that the sort of, even with the family names still attached, I think some of the like acrimony, some of the like sort of this is personal parts of it, but between the Lerners and really Lerner Senior and Angela Senior, let's call it that way. I think some of that recedes. I think the financial landscape in which all this stuff is playing out, multifaceted, has just changed. So I think this fight is probably less important to them. So I think and you're exactly right, for both of these franchises to get into kind of a clean, on multi-fronts way to sail. You just want to eliminate as many concerns, put away as much of the dirty laundry, et cetera, et cetera. I think they have the same motivations, right? So it's almost like, out of really was just been ridiculous from the beginning, you actually have almost like a golden path opening up if people are smart enough to take it.
If they're smart enough to take it. And I mean, again, you compared Angelos to Dan Snyder, which is, I think, valid. The man is very, very petty. This is probably personal to him, if I had to guess, because the
Yes.
Orioles owned the region, and all of a sudden they didn't own the region, and he went down, if you guys recall, kicking and screaming. He did not let a team move into the DC area for a long, long time until he was basically forced to by Major League Baseball. So I don't think he's ever gotten over that. And it has hurt his market. Let's be honest. It has cut into his market. I don't live in DC, neither do you, but there's now Nationals fans in DC when they were all Orioles fans before. Most of them. And now they're not.
Yeah. No, I think that would be, that would sort of, you could say the same thing about Ravens, Washington. I mean, so yes, it's sort of undeniable. You have teams this close. It's going to be a refiguring of the fan bases is going to happen. I would still argue that even if you said that was a drastic problem to the Orioles, it's still number two to what Angelos did to the fan base.
Probably. And all of this is to say, and we're just kind of speculating here, but all this is to say that if you consider who he is, the type of person Peter Angelos is, and the nature of the dispute here, will they do the smart thing and settle the rest of this? They may not. That's what I'm saying. They should, but will they? It might be one of those cases where it continues to linger on. Because seriously, you're going to argue about the arbitration. You're going to take a case about the identity of the arbitrators all the way to the New York highest court in New York. Really? Yeah, and it's not an accident that two different arbitration panels ruled the same against you and in the same amount. So there is apparently no question about the dispute. And you're going to continue to fight. The column we decided gives no indication of what the Royals want to do about it. But
I don't
the
think
fact
they know. With daddy on life support and the kids wanting a payday, I don't think they have a coherent thought.
Yeah, I don't either. And it also needs to be said that usually the kids of very, very wealthy, very, very influential people seem to be the younger, dumber. It's like genetics takes a bit of a holiday a lot of times. When it's got like this, if you go through like the Steinbrenner, kids, they're kind of the younger, dumber version of George Steinbrenner. The Lakers with the Buss family, Jerry Buss, such a great owner, and the kids are not, and it's the Bidwells maybe in Arizona, maybe the exception to that. They seem to be less controversial than Dad. But Angelos, I'd be willing to bet that the kids probably aren't as savvy even as Dad was.
Yeah. Yeah, I
Odds
agree. We could
are.
debate nature nurture on that one, but I agree with the outcome.
Exactly. So we'll see what happens. This is going to be one of these things that's going to be a long, ongoing debate, on this, or a topic rather, on this show. How much money? You want to take a bet? Okay, so here, let's do this. This was for what I say, 150 million, I think was the number. That is from 2012 to 2016. So there's 8 more years to go. The question is, where do they end up? How much money ultimately are the Orioles and MASN TV going to have to owe the Nationals? Is it going to be an easy 450 million? did the amounts change? I would argue that it's probably more between 2017 2020. So I'm going to say it goes up. I mean, like north of maybe 500 million in total.
That makes sense to me. I think may even probably end up being a little bit on the conservative side. The dumb part of this is that Angelos, I mean, he got a sweetheart deal just the way, because, through the negotiation with Major League Baseball and just getting them there. He should have just been I know this is going to sound crazy because billionaires are never just happy, but bear with me. He should have realized he won the ransom money, right? He extracted the pound of flesh for letting it happen. The kind of continuing to try to ask for more, get more, steal more in the process, is what they're actually debating right here. He sort of took the ransom price and then kept sending ransom notes.
So yeah, something along those lines. But and this just comes back to his own personal pettiness in some cases.
Yes.
Again, it's very Dan Snyder, because if this was the NFL, this is exactly what Dan Snyder would do. Continue to keep filing lawsuits, argue for years and decades. So it's I like your comparison. He's kind of Dan Snyder before Dan Snyder. That's
right.
probably not inaccurate.
Hipsters should cite Angelos. He likes Snyder. I was into Angelos first.
So we will see what happens going forward.
All right, we got one more story here, and that is some recent news that the NBA is about to have some layoffs, and they're claiming that, sort of financial belt tightening. Current, quote unquote, current economic crisis or current economic climate, if they're taking an opportunity to slash some payroll.
I saw this in Front Office Sports, which is one of our regular haunts for this show. NBA makes budget cuts, stops hiring amid economic headwinds. Andrew Cohen is the credit for this, April 12th, 2023. So what's a bit ironic about this is this column simultaneously talks about how the 2022-2023 season set all-time records for attendance and sellouts, sold the most tickets for a regular season in league history. Yet the league itself is acting like revenue's down. Why are they doing this? I think it's because everybody with a brain is expecting a recession. I think they're probably planning for the future here more so than, and also, by the way, this is another league that has obviously a big media rights contract, but more importantly, it's coming up for renewal here in I believe 2024. Yeah, 2024, 2025. So there's going to be that kind of additional revenue coming in too. I think this is really just all about the potential for major recession given the economic climate in the United States. And so a lot of companies are kind of doing this sort of thing now. So what this says is they're implementing hiring freeze, other cost cutting measures. The quote here says, in a memo obtained by the New York Times sent to NBA staffers Tuesday, the league said it was, quote, facing a very different economic reality than just 1 year ago. We're seeing significant challenges to achieving our revenue budget with additional downside risks still in front of us. The additional downside risk is that there's a major recession, and then the people's extraneous income to do things like go to basketball games disappears. So I think it's less about money going down now as they're planning for the future. Thoughts?
Oh, I couldn't agree more. I mean, you just open up the business page in your national, local, regional, statewide paper or whatever. You get that information. You're going to see stories like this across all industries. And I actually don't. I think it is more commentary on macro conditions than it is the certain realities of that business or industry. This same article also mentions that the NFL is doing the same thing. Are we anyone going to argue that the NFL is in a bad position? No. All these companies are forecasting ahead and adjusting accordingly, and that means cutting at the low-hanging fruit first. I just talked to, keep this as generic as possible, but talked to somebody who worked at a national brand And they told me about how in the last like 4 months their 401k matching has gone away, parental leave was slashed, all that kind of benefit packagey type of stuff. As well as probably a round of low-level layoffs is happening. This is so to me, this has a sort of sexiness factor of being obviously a big, front of the stage industry, and so that it pops a little bit from the business page, but not that much more. And Adam Silver, if you look at it, he sings from the same songbook that you'd see from the quote from any of the CEs or operating officers or whoever provides a quote at these companies about what's happening. So to me, this is as generic as it gets.
Yeah, absolutely. And this mentions ESPN is undergoing layoffs. Disney owns ESPN. They laid off, I think, was it 7,000 this week alone?
Yeah.
I think it was 7,000. So yeah, it's corporate. It's just in case anybody's wondering, this is what happens when you have a federal government that cannot stop spending money that it doesn't have. Okay, I don't want to get into the politics of what they're spending it on because it's not what we do, but when the government continually raises the national debt by several $trillion every year because it cannot stop spending money, what happens is the value of the dollar goes down because they have to inject more money into the economy, which causes prices to go up, which causes the economy to go in the tank, which causes things like layoffs and corporate restructurings and all of this. So that is what's going on here. And so, again, we can argue about the politics of what later, but this is what happens when the government does not stop spending money. I would like to point out that the national debt, which is about a little under $32 trillion, is actually larger than the country's gross domestic product at this point. So this is what they're worried about on like what Chris was talking about, these corporations are worried about on a really macro level, is that the current spending crisis that the government has self-imposed upon us is going to cause the economy to tank. That is my view of what is going on here.
I agree with the outcome. We probably disagree on the factors, but I think that's undeniable that that's what the reaction is. Reaction is two.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, it's kind of funny. No one would argue that Alphabet, aka Google, isn't struggling. Yet they had months and months of news stories about layoffs.
Yeah. And Chris and I are from dramatically different sides. We get along, but we're from dramatically different sides of the political
It can
aisles.
happen, folks.
Yeah. Occasionally we agree. Sometimes we don't. I think we sort of agree on this and sort of not, but again, that's another podcast. We're trying to stick to sports here, but so I'm probably teetering on the edge of what we should be talking about here. But I think the takeaway from this here is that while the NBA is trying to cut costs, this has nothing to do with the popularity of the NBA. Let's say it like that.
Yeah, or their fiscal health. You talk about that next media deal is going to be boffo. Tickets are up. Ratings are fine. So yeah, I mean, it's like what the fundamentals of the NBA are. Let's just call them fine, right? Sort of even kind of even non-committal. But the macroeconomics are shaky.
Yeah. Yeah, right. Again, the fundamentals are fine. The business is okay. We just heard, we've been over ratings on this show, and they got simultaneously slaughtered by the NFL on Christmas, but also the ratings were up from
Well,
what it
they
was.
set their own personal highs. Yeah.
Yeah, right. And so it's like two things are true at once. The NFL is the king, always will be the king, at least for now, is the king currently, at least. The NBA was happy about what happened, even though they got hammered. They did better than they ever have. So multiple things are true at once. And so the health of the league is fine. They're worried about big picture macroeconomic issues, which in my view are created by the government, which is another show.
Well, the other, if you want to, and we don't have to go too deep into this, but we've talked about this before. You also don't know here the impact of their investment return and warm bedfellows with China here and macro situations that go on there that have nothing to do with, entertainment at all, like let alone the NBA or whatever. So you also don't know how, let's just call it uncertainty, in the Chinese market also plays into, it's another macro pipeline into their big bottom line.
Yeah, don't forget. I mean, when Daryl Morey, who was the former GM of the Houston Rockets a couple years ago, decided he felt the need to tweet about save Shanghai or whatever he did, why the NBA felt the need to say a guy with a master's degree from MIT is stupid and doesn't know what he's talking about was to protect the NBA's interest in China, which is far more important to them than anybody's feelings about whether people are subject to communist rule or not. So this is why you had morons like LeBron James having to speak up about in support of China. So all of that is uncertain, and I think that's a big part of it. I think that's a good point, Chris, which is the uncertainty with China, which we're teetering on some of the worst relations with China I think we've probably ever had. It's safe to say, at least in modern times. And that brings a level of uncertainty to the NBA for sure, because I believe that's their biggest market, including the United States. Or
Yeah,
source
so
of income, rather. Yeah.
I that's undeniable to me. You've had the active but non-explosive volcano of Taiwan bubble for decades, half a century or whatever. Right? Like we're talking about pretty long timescapes, and that if you're watching the seismic activity on that volcano, it is it would be ticking up. So and those even a slight tick ups in those kind of tensions or issues have massive implications for their investments and their income from the Chinese market.
In case anybody's wondering, if anybody out there doesn't know this, the reason why Taiwan is so important, and we're straying from sports here, but it's okay. Taiwan makes like something along the lines of 90% of the world's semiconductors. Semiconductors are the parts that go in the chips that run everything from your phone to your TV to your cars to absolutely everything that is electronic has semiconductors. Semiconductors is actually a material that's used to build the tiny chips. And so Taiwan builds something like 90% of the world's semiconductors in those little chips. And so the problem is if China takes over Taiwan, then you have China in control of 90% of the world's technology, essentially. That is why it's strategically important. So just bear that, again, that's another show, but just bear that in mind. So yes, I think to summarize the story, I think part of it is the NBA being concerned about the state of the U.S. economy and the obvious recessions coming. And two, yes, the foreign relations with China, probably the biggest impactor on their bottom line.
Yeah, so they have two pretty large existential threats to what is right now a good business model, but
Yes.
right now isn't tomorrow.
Right. So we'll see what happens.
Yeah, no, it's fascinating. So Steve, you probably got an endless run of draft recaps coming up on the Hog side.
Yes, we do. We are recording this on Saturday morning. We're in the midst of our draft coverage, which means I get to watch like 6 hours of television today to keep up with it all. But we are in the midst of writing about all of it. We will be talking about all of it, working on a guest for the Hogs Tie for next week to talk about it more. So stay tuned for that. And we have all of our regular written content as well.
All right. So with that, we will see you in 2 weeks.